For decades, economists have whispered about a horror story scenario, a single event that could bring the global economy to its knees. This isn't just a theory anymore. It's the reality we are waking up to as conflict in Iran escalates. What we are seeing today is the kind of nightmare that has kept financial analysts up at night for generations. The Strait of Hormuz, often described as the world's most critical energy cul-de-sac, is effectively closed for business. There is essentially only one way in and one way out of the Persian Gulf for water transport, and that door has just been slammed shut. In just the first week of this conflict, the implications for the global economy have become terrifyingly clear. This isn't just about a spike in prices at your local gas station. It is a systemic shock affecting everything from the high-tech magnets in hospital MRI scanners to the fertilizer needed to grow the world's food supply. We are witnessing the world's biggest oil terminal, Ras Tanura in Saudi Arabia, and the world's biggest gas terminal, Ras Laffan in Qatar, both going offline due to drone attacks. Tanker attacks are now frequent occurrences throughout the Gulf, particularly concentrated around the Strait, but stretching into the northern reaches of the Persian Gulf. This is Operation Epic Fury, and its economic ripples are only just beginning to be felt. To understand why this is so catastrophic, you have to look at the numbers. About 20 to 25% of the entire world's oil consumption passes through that narrow stretch of water in the Strait of Hormuz. In 2025 alone, more than 14 million barrels of crude oil were moving through this waterway every single day. Now, oil is sitting loaded on tankers with nowhere to go, trapped by a vow from Iran to attack any ship attempting to transit the strait. This follows massive airstrikes and a heightening of tensions that has investors incredibly concerned that this is not a short-term disruption. Wall Street's heavy hitters, JP Morgan, Bank of America, Barclays, and Deutsche Bank, have all issued the same warning. If this closure is prolonged, global benchmark Brent oil prices will easily shoot above $100 a barrel. While the oil price initially jumped by about 15% in the first few days of the conflict, it's actually the natural gas market that is showing the most extreme volatility. In the UK, gas prices surged by 70%, and at one point even doubled, hitting a 100% increase. Why is there such a massive difference between the reaction of oil and gas? The sources tell us it's a physical reality of the commodities themselves. It is significantly harder to store natural gas than it is to store oil. Because storage is limited, the market's sensitivity to supply disruptions is much higher. Furthermore, the oil market entered this conflict relatively well stocked. Global supply had been running slightly above demand, meaning many countries outside the Middle East had built up a decent cushion of oil reserves. However, that sense of security is localized. Inside the Middle East, the story is far more dire. Producers like Iraq only have about 6 days of storage capacity. Kuwait has 14 days, and the UAE has roughly 19. If these countries cannot get their oil out through the strait, they run out of places to put it almost immediately. This forces them into a radical and dangerous position. They have to shut down production. In the oil industry, shutting down facilities isn't like flipping a light switch. It can cause long-term physical damage to the infrastructure, permanently reducing the amount of oil that can be extracted in the future. We've seen this happen in places like Venezuela, and now the same risk looms over the world's most productive oil region. It is also important to remember that it isn't just raw crude and gas that are being blocked. We are talking about refined products that run our modern world. Jet fuel, or kerosene, has seen its price in Singapore spike 52% almost instantly. This means that the cost of air travel and global logistics is skyrocketing. If you want to buy a plane ticket, it will likely be more expensive tomorrow than it is today. Then there is the agricultural impact. Between 30% and 40% of the world's fertilizer is produced in the Gulf and shipped through the Strait of Hormuz. Fertilizer prices have already jumped 30% since January in anticipation of these disruptions. Higher fertilizer costs eventually lead to higher food prices globally, adding another layer of inflation to an already stressed global economy. Perhaps the most surprising consequence of this war is the helium shortage. Most people think of helium for party balloons, but it is actually a vital byproduct of natural gas refining. Because Qatar, which produces 1/3 of the world's helium, has had to shut down its Ras Laffan terminal due to security threats, the global supply has vanished overnight. This is a massive problem for healthcare. Helium is essential for cooling the superconducting magnets used in MRI scanners to near absolute zero. Without it, those machines cannot function. It is also critical for the future of quantum computing. Furthermore, a quarter of the world's sulfuric acid production comes from the Gulf. Without sulfuric acid, you cannot manufacture explosives, and you cannot refine metals like copper. This is why copper prices are expected to climb, not because the copper itself is missing, but because the cost of refining it has become prohibitive. Now, let's look at the geopolitical chessboard. While the US White House insists that the American economy is robust and strong enough to weather these temporary impacts, the reality on the ground is more complex. Yes, the US is a net exporter of energy and has a global oil glut, providing a small cushion, but oil is a global commodity. When global supply drops, domestic prices inevitably rise. For the American consumer, the biggest hit comes through the Federal Reserve. Higher oil and gas prices are a massive inflationary measure that makes everything from manufacturing to doorstep delivery more expensive. The Fed has been working tirelessly to bring inflation down to a 2% target. With energy costs soaring, the hope for interest rate cuts has essentially evaporated. Currently, markets are pricing in a 98% chance that the Fed will hold rates steady, meaning mortgages and loans will remain expensive for the foreseeable future. However, there is a strategic angle to this conflict that all roads lead to China. 3/4 of the energy exports passing through the Strait of Hormuz are destined for 4 major Asian economies: China, India, Japan, and South Korea. China is particularly vulnerable, as Middle East oil represents approximately half of all its crude imports. Analysts suggest that by putting pressure on Iran, the US is indirectly targeting China's energy security. If the US can control the flow of oil, or make it more difficult for China to access, it raises the cost of China's global adventurism. Some even argue this could make it significantly harder for China to move on Taiwan in the future. China seems to have anticipated this, as they have been aggressively buying up commodities for their strategic reserves, potentially giving them a short-term buffer against these disruptions. Finally, we have to consider the fate of the Gulf region itself. Places like Dubai have seen a breakneck rise in both population and economic importance over the last few decades. In the 1970s, the UAE had a population roughly the size of Iceland's. Today, it is home to the world's busiest international airport. But that airport is now effectively down. The massive Jebel Ali container port, which is central to trade between Europe and Singapore, can no longer function as it once did. The Gulf economies are also uniquely dependent on immigrant labor. In many of these countries, the vast majority of the population is non-native. If the region remains a war zone, there is a profound question of whether this workforce will stay or flee out of nervousness. For those living within the Gulf, the crisis is even more immediate. This is the region that receives the world's shipments of grain and food, much of which can no longer pass through the strait. The Iran war is more than just a conflict between nations. It is a structural break in the global economic order. Whether it's the 52% spike in jet fuel, the loss of a third of the world's helium, or the 98% chance of high interest rates, the world is now navigating a horror story that has become all too real. As this conflict continues, the question is no longer if the global economy will change, but how much of it will be left standing when the dust finally settles.